Great, thank you so much, Dayal. That was a very helpful update especially on the implementation or non-implementation of reservations at the IITs. And also it's really reassuring to hear about all of the student activism around caste inequality and other forms of exclusion. When I was doing my research at IIT Madras, the APSC was incredibly helpful. I had some very illuminating interviews with APSC members, so I'm really happy to see that the APSC is also a sponsor of this event. So let me go ahead and get started. I'm going to be reading a paper for 40 minutes, and then I'd be happy to take any questions that you have. So as Dayal said, the title of the talk is Meritocracy and Democracy, the Social Life of Caste in India. In India today, the term merit is a ubiquitous one that generates a lot of political heat. Over the post-independence period, merit has come to reference forms of distinction that have a much longer social life. And while there are various social distinctions that are at stake in public debates around who does or does not have merit, the most politically charged point of reference is caste. The relationship between caste and merit is widely debated, but nowhere more vocally and consistently than in engineering education. Within the world of Indian engineering education, the institutions seen as most meritocratic are the IITs, which are the focus of my research. A set of originally 5 institutions founded between 1951 and 61 and deemed institutions of national importance by the IIT Act of 1961, the IITs are directly administered and financed by the Indian central government and fall outside the structure of affiliation to universities, which gives them far greater autonomy in institutional functioning, faculty hiring, and curricular development. Their autonomy was guaranteed in other ways as well. In the name of ensuring merit as the only basis for admission, they were originally exempted from reservation policies. Soon after their founding, the IITs became stepping stones to transnational mobility, especially to the United States. From the 1970s, the professional and economic successes of IIT alumni in both India and the US generated a mad rush to gain admission, pushing the number of candidates steadily upward and spawning a massive coaching industry to train students in exam preparation. Within Indian public discourse, the IITian has become an exemplar of intellectual merit, someone seen as naturally gifted in technical knowledge. What gets obscured in such assessments of the IITian's innate intelligence and competitiveness are the forms of historical advantage that have enabled admission to the IITs. The majority of IITians come from upper caste families of bureaucrats and academics, where capital has long been held in education. While arguably from middle class backgrounds, the value of their accumulated caste capital has spiked due to the reorganization of late 20th and early 21st century capitalism around the knowledge economy. At the same time, the role of caste and of the state in producing IITians has been obscured in favor of their portrayal as uniquely meritorious individuals. The IIT story provokes some important questions. I think somebody's mic is not muted. Okay. The IIT story provokes some important questions. How does historical advantage become merit? How does the naturalization of the IITian's merit inform understandings of caste difference? And what does this mean for the possibilities and limits of democratic transformation
and early 21st century capitalism around the knowledge economy? At the same time, the role of caste and of the state in producing IITians has been obscured in favor of their portrayal as uniquely meritorious individuals. The IIT story provokes some important questions. How does historical advantage become merit? How does the naturalization of the IITian's merit inform understandings of caste difference? And what does this mean for the possibilities and limits of democratic transformation in India? Before I turn to the research, let me say a little more about my reasons for taking on this project. One of the main aims was to interrogate the widespread assumption that caste is a more salient basis of social distinction and self-definition for lower than for upper caste. More specifically, upper caste urban professionals are thought to have transcended caste to adopt more modern forms of identification. At the same time, professional classes and institutional spaces like the IITs continue to be largely upper caste in composition. Moreover, attempts at opening up these spaces to lower caste are consistently met with fervent opposition, not in the name of caste, but in the name of preserving merit. Despite continuing caste stratification and the claims to merit by upper caste, there is little scholarship that brings these issues together. And this is where I see my work coming in. I look at the role of engineering education and the IITs in particular in producing claims to merit as expressions of upper caste identity. To get at the relationship between caste and merit, I build on the work of sociologist Satish Deshpande on how upper castes are rendered casteless in India. The story of how upper castes transform their caste capital into modern capital is not well known, he says, because it runs with the grain of the dominant common sense. When it is seen and heard, it appears to be a story about something other than caste, like the story of nation building, for example. By contrast, the political use of caste by lower caste is a recurrent, publicly debated theme. The result of this asymmetry, Deshpande maintains, is that the upper castes are naturalized as the casteless inheritors of modernity, while lower castes are hyper-visible as the illegitimate purveyors of caste. For upper caste, he concludes, caste qua caste has yielded all that it can and represents a ladder that can now be safely kicked away. Having encashed its traditional caste capital and converted it into modern forms of capital like property, higher educational credentials, and strongholds in lucrative professions, this section believes itself to be casteless today. My work builds on Deshpande's but adds a key component, and this is the relationship between subaltern assertion and capital accumulation. Strategies of upper caste capital accumulation must be understood in relation to oppositional politics. This allows us to see how caste emerges out of longer historical dynamics and continues to be reconfigured in the context of democratic politics. But it's also to make a larger point that historical advantage does not simply reproduce itself. The proliferation of rights politics and the entry of new groups into social and economic spaces previously monopolized by upper caste have posed real challenges to caste hierarchies. The claim to merit is one strategy aimed at stabilizing the flux of political life in order to secure arenas of expertise and accumulation against lower caste advancement. However, even this claim to merit is not a guarantee and has to be continuously recalibrated in the face of new challenges. My work on the IITs tracks such changing expressions of upper caste identity. While I look at the IIT system as a whole, my main focus is on IIT Madras. Tamil Nadu is a particularly illuminating context in which to look at the relationship between lower caste assertion and upper caste capital accumulation, because its history of caste politics has complicated the naturalization of merit and the transformation of upper caste into casteless moderns. Here, as in other regions with histories of lower caste rights politics, merit is understood as a product of historical advantage and not simply of innate ability. In this sense, Tamil Nadu calls into question Deshpande's account of castelessness as a stable structure of upper caste self-definition. Departing from his analysis, I ask how dynamics in Tamil Nadu might inform an analysis of caste more broadly. When are claims to merit made on the basis of castelessness and when on the basis of caste? What are the forms of cultural capital that continue to mark status and stigma, even in the absence of explicit invocations of caste? Let me now turn to my research. I'll first give you a brief account of the role of caste in colonial technical education, and then turn to IIT Madras and the making of upper caste identity through claims to merit. For the post-independence period, I will look specifically at three phenomena: reservations, mass examinations, and diasporic mobility, and use each to show how the contours of upper caste identity have shifted in response to new challenges. But first, let's go back to the 19th century. Caste played a critical role in the induction of Indians into formal technical training in the late colonial period. Through the 19th and early 20th centuries, racial barriers to technical education were expressed through a clear preference for engineers from England. It was only with the rise in nationalist criticism of colonial rule and the expansion of public works that the colonial government began to invest more systematically in formal technical education for Indians. The question of what kind of training this would be and what kind of person was best suited for it was hotly debated. From the beginning, we see tensions between two views of engineering. First, expressed an older orientation around engineering as practical learning, unsuited to the classroom. The second, newer view argued for the importance of engineering as formal conceptual education, aligned with the social hierarchies of the colony. While this debate endured into the 20th century, the call to formalize engineering as classroom education ultimately won out. Although technical skill was more clearly evident among lower caste artisans and tradesmen, the emerging consensus over engineering as classroom learning and its connection to state power made literate upper caste the principal targets of this new knowledge. In elevating the classroom as the principal site of engineering training, education planners marginalized those who had technique in favor of those schooled in reading and writing. From the outset, we see a convergence between a colonial administrative sociology of caste, the stratification of technical training, and new modes of collective self-representation. Even as upper castes were inducted into modern professions, where secular credentials were ostensibly more important than family and community, the preoccupation with caste-appropriate choices persisted. Rather than a shift from caste to castelessness, the modern engineer was always also a caste self. For their part, colonial officials were happy to accommodate caste prejudices in order to enhance the status and growth of engineering. In effect, upper caste status anxieties and colonial policy dovetailed in consigning those social groups with a history of technical skill to the margins of the growing field of engineering. In many ways, Madras Presidency was an extreme case of the caste stratification of technical training. Here, the categories of Brahmin and non-Brahmin had become foundational units of administrative sociology through which technical training was implemented. Through the 1910s, concern with the erosion of so-called non-Brahmin occupations and the need to enhance hereditary skills in wood, metal, and textiles remained a centerpiece of technical policy in Madras. Such efforts, distinguishing non-Brahmin from Brahmin pursuits, strengthened and naturalized the link between caste and technical skills. The effects in the engineering field were clear. As the numbers of Europeans in Madras's engineering profession fell, Brahmins were the single largest group to fill the vacuum, despite being barely 3% of the regional population. The correlation between caste and occupation and the overrepresentation of Brahmins in the modern professions became a rallying cry of the non-Brahmin and Dravidian movements, which profoundly reshaped the Tamil political and social milieu. Within the technical sciences, too, the impact of Dravidianism was far-reaching. The Southeast was one of the first regions where caste quotas in technical education and employment were implemented. These measures have had considerable success at changing the caste composition of engineering from the days when Tamil Brahmins filled over 70% of seats in regional engineering colleges. One of the lasting effects of Dravidianism has been a cleavage between Tamil Nadu's other castes and Tamil Brahmins, with caste privilege more closely tied to Brahminness than in many other parts of India. To turn Deshpande's argument on its head, Dravidianism interrupted the translation of caste capital into modern capital by making Brahmins hyper-visible as caste, a move that has been an important catalyst for a more far-reaching politics of meritocracy. An early moment when we see the impact of Dravidianism is 1951, with the first post-independence legal challenge to caste quotas. Two Tamil Brahmin petitioners claimed that their fundamental right to equality and non-discrimination, guaranteed by Article 15.1 of the Constitution, was violated by regional quotas in medical and engineering colleges. The Madras High Court agreed. In a key passage, the judgment stated, and this is a long quote, "It may be that through the fortuitous operation of a rule, which in itself is not discriminatory, a special advantage is enjoyed by some citizens belonging to a particular caste or community. This advantage is not taken away by Article 15.1. If students belonging to a certain caste or community, by reason of their caste discipline, habits and modes of life, satisfy the prescribed requirements in larger number than others, it is not permissible to shut them out on that score. It would be strange if in this land of equality and liberty, a class of citizens should be constrained to wear the badge of inferiority because they have a greater aptitude for certain types of education than other classes," unquote. The judgment redefined caste in two ways, from a system of graded inequality into community life, and from a form of historical advantage into collective aptitude. Moreover, it identified the quota itself as the source of discrimination. Deshpande argues that the 1951 verdict offered upper caste a form of agency based on the universal normative position of castelessness. Constitutionally and legally, caste was henceforth to be recognized only as a source of disadvantage or vulnerability, not as a source of privilege or advantage. That's the end of his quote. As such, he continues, the quote continues, "It authored and disseminated a new kind of common sense, where the very definition of caste was truncated and equated with the lower caste." That's the end of his quote. Significantly, this common sense only deepened after the courts shifted in favor of quotas. Those who qualified for quotas were included in the reserved category on the basis of their caste affiliation, whereas those who did not qualify were simply classed under the general category of merit-based admission. This absenting of caste from the general category has profoundly shaped the debate around educational equality in India. The distinction between the meritorious or casteless on one side and the reserved or caste-based on the other has allowed those who fall within the general category to argue that it is reservation and not historical privilege that produces inequality and undermines equal citizenship. However, there's another side to the 1951 judgment that also lives on. And this is the definition of caste as culture, as natural aptitude, and as the very basis of merit. The judgment set the stage for a politics of self-definition through which Tamil Brahmins equated caste belonging with having merit, which they argued was threatened by the very existence of the reserved category. With the expansion of lower caste rights politics across India, this claim to merit as the non-reserved has become a more generalized phenomenon, seen not just in legal challenges to reservations, but in collective protests and in more everyday practices. In this sense, caste dynamics in Tamil Nadu set an important precedent for making the general category a putatively democratic norm whose external limit is lower casteness. So let us now turn to the IITs to look more closely at how the Tamil Brahmin precedent set the stage for an expanding politics of meritocracy. As I noted earlier, three phenomena have been central to the making of upper caste identity at the IITs. The first is reservation. It was in the context of Tamil Brahmin legal challenges to reservations that IIT Madras was founded in 1959. As a central government institution exempt from regional caste quotas, it was quickly coveted by Tamil Brahmins as a meritocratic space, shielded from lower caste claims, where talent would find its due. This changed in 1973, when central government quotas for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes were extended to the IITs. Although there was opposition from all of the IITs, it was IIT Madras that led the charge in condemning the move as government overreach and a violation of meritocracy. Still, the extreme marginality and presumed intellectual inferiority of students admitted through the 1973 quota did little to destabilize an existing campus norm of IITians coming from families of upper caste civil servants with shared histories of education and employment. Within Tamil Nadu, it is Brahmins who historically form the core of this group. Unlike upper caste from other parts of India, Tamil Brahmins, as targets of Dravidianism, responded most defensively to the quota by claiming IIT Madras as their own. We see this in the story of Karthik, a Tamil Brahmin alumnus who characterized IIT Madras as the singular ambition of Tamil Brahmin boys shut out of regional education. For us, he told me, it was IIT Madras or nothing. All other colleges admit by caste. Only IIT is by merit. But immediately after disavowing the presence of caste at the IITs, Karthik emphasized how much IIT Madras felt like home. He talked about the comforting sense of homecoming upon entering the campus, where Brahmin Tamil was commonplace, and where he experienced a form of caste kinship between Tamil Brahmin students and professors, expressed in shared intellectual projects and invitations to family functions. But IIT Madras was not simply a site for Brahmin caste kinship within a so-called non-Brahmin region. Lower caste Tamils who gained admission through the general category were also assumed to be Brahmin. Gopi, a non-Brahmin alumnus, told me a story that captured this perfectly. He was changing his clothes when his Tamil Brahmin roommate inquired into the whereabouts of his punal. When I told him that I don't wear one, my roommate paused and then asked, "Doesn't your mother get upset?" It never struck him that I'm backward caste. In fact, I think he still assumes that I'm from a particularly liberal Brahmin family. Gopi's experience speaks not to the castelessness of the IITian, but to the assumption that any Tamil who gets in on merit is by definition Brahmin. Other practices were also thought to reflect Brahminness. The display of bodily neglect was one. Ratty t-shirts, torn jeans, and chappals signaled a Brahmin background, where the consumption of knowledge was prized above commodity consumption. By contrast, dressing well was indicative of being a nouveau riche lower caste, who didn't truly value knowledge. These assumptions acquired a disciplining force. Palani, a lower caste student from Chennai, told me how he made a point of switching out his shoes for chappals when he came back to campus after weekends at home. It was just easier, he said, than standing out. His desire to erase difference is particularly telling in the context of a region where a history of quotas has brought increasing numbers of lower caste into previously upper caste institutional spaces. Here, IIT Madras serviced the need to once again differentiate high from low. As caste status boundaries were blurring in the wider region, within the walls of the institution, it was crucial to mark the lower caste general category Tamil as Brahmin. It was a different story for scheduled castes who got in through the 1973 quota. One particularly telling instance was of Dinesh, a Dalit student who was a topper at a predominantly upper caste school in Chennai. Throughout his school days, he told me, his classmates would come up with elaborate explanations for why he was the exception that proved the norm of Dalit intellectual inferiority. Although his rank in the IIT admissions exam made him eligible for the general category, he decided to claim the quota to get a better choice of engineering branch. And because, as he put it, it was my right. To his frustration, this became evidence that in the end, I couldn't make the cut. Even when I pointed out that if I hadn't taken a quota seat, one of them wouldn't have gotten in, they still pretended that I didn't have the marks to get in on merit. All these instances, Gopi's misrecognition as Brahmin, Palani's attempts to fit in, and the denial of Dinesh's intellect, point to the assumed composition of the general category. While it supposedly marks a form of achievement available to all, assumptions about the caste bases of merit are ever present. Within IIT Madras, to be lower caste was to be non-meritorious. Moreover, non-Brahmin Tamils were forced to erase the complexity of their own history to produce flattened forms of caste difference that aligned with expectations of who did or didn't have merit. How then did this regional dynamic set a precedent for a wider politics of meritocracy? In the 1990s, lower caste rights politics spread to other parts of India, resulting in the emergence of new constituencies and parties. One of the outcomes of this political ferment was the implementation in 1990 and 2008 of new central government quotas for OBCs that, when combined with the 1973 quota, expanded the reserved category to nearly half the student body of central government institutions like the IITs. As a result, what had been a regional interplay of non-Brahmin claims to rights and Brahmin claims to merit expanded nationally. But now when such claims were articulated, they expressed not Brahminness, but a consolidated form of upper caste identity. The 1990 quota ignited a firestorm in North India, with students engaging in street protests and masquerading as vendors, sweepers, and shoe shiners in a graphic depiction of their future reduction to lower caste labor. At the same time, one of the accusations leveled against the quota was that it was responsible for the spread of casteism, even of caste consciousness. Echoing the 1951 judgment, its detractors defined the quota as a violation of the ideal of equality and the reserved as singularly undeserving. The 2006 quota, which was then implemented in 2008, further entrenched the opposition between general and reserved as widely shared categories through which the Indian public understood caste difference. In news articles, films, jokes, and online debates emerged an upside-down world where stigmatization and exclusion were the plight of the general category, and the reserved were illegitimate beneficiaries of state corruption. Unmistakable in such commentary was the outrage at the disruption of a natural order, where upper caste dominance was assumed to be a byproduct of talent and deservingness. At the IITs, the ramifications of expanding reservations have been far-reaching. The existence of an OBC quota has produced a more explicit association between the general category and being upper caste. Moreover, after 2008, private sector job recruiters have become vigilant about only hiring general category students. Several who got into IIT Madras through the 73 and 2006 quotas recounted their chagrin at being pointedly asked for their JEE rank at the final stage of recruitment. Despite doing well up to that point, most didn't get the jobs. There's thus emerging a two-tier system of employment, which ensures that general category students are assumed to be upper caste, and only they are seen as legitimate IITians. To sum up this section, the expansion of reservations has expanded an upper caste identity politics of merit from regional to national scale. Just as Dravidianism catalyzed Tamil Brahmin claims to merit, now the expansion of lower caste rights nationally has led to a similarly reactive upper caste politics. Particularly in the context of higher education and private sector employment, the polarized categories of the general and the reserved have superseded more localized affiliations to become a new scale of caste difference. Still, this process of caste consolidation has not been smooth. The instability of upper caste identity becomes more evident when we consider the second phenomenon shaping dynamics at the IITs, and this is the mass examination. The mass examination is commonly taken as an index of modern meritocracy. Unlike earlier processes of selection that explicitly favored a high-born elite, the mass examination was underwritten by an ideology of middle-class achievement, where labor was supposed to find its just rewards. Its scale and finely calibrated set of ranked outcomes stood in for a process of objective evaluation beyond social and political influence. However, this assumption is belied by the structuring force of economic and social relations and by the ideological power of cultural assumptions. As filtering mechanisms, mass examinations typically favor those who come from histories of education. and have a facility with this technical instrument. A case in point is the JEE, which arguably represents the fullest realization of India's examination fetish. The JEE is widely perceived as a near perfect measure of merit because the pan-Indian scope of the exam is assumed to filter only the best out of a vast pool of applicants. However, it has been anything but a democratizing force. As noted earlier, the majority of IITians used to be children of upper caste civil servants. Their parents, themselves participants in another All India ritual, the Union Public Service Commission exam, made a point of training their children to succeed in the intense competitiveness of examination culture. These structural continuities have made caste and class history key to exam success, even as perceptions of the UPSC and JEE as objective filters of individual ability have reinforced an ideology of meritocratic achievement. In this instance as well, a more explicit claim to merit as a caste trait was first expressed by Tamil Brahmins. From the 1940s, Tamil Brahmins who felt shut out of regional educational institutions and employment by the quota system invested heavily in exam preparation to enter central government schools, colleges, and bureaucracies, a phenomenon that one Tamil Brahmin IITian referred to as a caste culture of coaching. With the opening of IIT Madras, this caste culture was directed towards a new goal. I heard many stories of mothers burning the midnight oil with their children, coaxing them to do practice tests so they could crack the JEE. There's a palpable sense within these accounts of both resentment and intellectual superiority, a combined claim to being a scapegoated and a uniquely deserving and talented caste. In the past 10 years, JEE exam coaching, which was once a more Brahmin phenomenon, has exploded into a billion-dollar industry. The expansion of coaching has shifted the class profile of students at IIT Madras to include a large contingent from rural upper caste families in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. Their arrival, however, has not been met with equanimity. In a newspaper interview about the proliferation of coaching classes, a former director of IIT Madras clarified that he was, quote, looking for students with raw intelligence and not those with a mind prepared by coaching class tutors. The coaching classes only help students in mastering pattern recognition skills. With this, you cannot get students with raw intelligence, unquote. This notion of raw intelligence places the ideal IITian outside institutional or even social formation as a naturally gifted individual with a native capacity for technical knowledge. In conversations with him and other IIT administrators, I heard their concerns that the coaching industry undermined the ability of the exam to test for those who were truly worthy, in the process admitting students to the general category who are not actually gifted. It is clear that this divide between the gifted and the coached is not about who attends coaching classes, because virtually all IITians do. So who then are the coached? When pushed on this, I heard that they were from less urban, professional, and English-speaking backgrounds. They were the ones who attended the so-called coaching factories, where learning was rote, unlike the more boutique conceptual classes attended by the urban middle class. As with the performance of bodily neglect, the distinction between the gifted and the coached is understood through specific qualities. The one most often mentioned is groupism. Students from coaching factories are routinely charged with changing campus culture by bringing in their regional affiliations and languages. Although Brahmin, Tamil, and Hindi are also heard quite commonly on campus, it is Telugu that is marked as regional and parochial. Of course, other forms of collectivity are key to what it means to be an IITian. I heard numerous stories of male bonding over all-night debates on everything from obscure mathematical formulas to the evidence of science in the Vedas. Such stories take place in the dorm room and not the classroom, and are key to institutional kinship. But it's only Telugu speakers who are taken as a disruptive collective presence. In some ways, it is these students who most destabilize the equation of merit with being upper caste. As noted earlier, the implementation of the 2006 to 8 quota has made it even easier to consign all lower caste students to the undeserving reserved category. But Telugu students are problematic because they are the wrong kind of upper caste. Their supposed rote learning, bad English, and open embrace of regionalism blur the boundary between the general and the reserved. To recap again, at the IITs, the challenges to upper caste dominance posed by successive waves of reservation produced a polarized student body and an incessant diagnostics of caste to root out the undeserving. However, the entry of Telugu students has been unsettling, leading those from class histories of higher education and professional employment to distinguish themselves not just from lower caste, but from non-ideal upper caste in order to claim merit as their exclusive property. That the claim to merit is in fact about property becomes clearer when we consider the final phenomenon, which is diasporic or transnational mobility. Caste inheritances have long been key to mobility. Here too, the Tamil Brahmin story prefigures a more widespread pattern. Over the 20th century, and in the face of lower caste demands for the redistribution of power and resources, Tamil Brahmins have used mobility from countryside to city, from public to private sector, and from South India to the north and to other countries as a means to secure their economic and social standing. In Tamil Brahmin narratives, mobility comes across as an expression of cultural genius that across successive generations has allowed them to preserve merit against the odds. The Tamil Brahmin use of mobility as a form of maneuver anticipated similar trends across India. In the post-independence period, diasporic mobility emerged as a key tool for a wide spectrum of upper caste, looking to secure the conditions for capital accumulation in the face of lower caste demands for access to public education and state employment. From the 1960s, the US emerged as the favored destination and quickly became the most affluent, the most upper caste, and the most highly educated node of the diaspora. Diasporic success has been hugely significant for reinforcing the link between meritocracy and caste in India, even as caste privilege and disadvantage are largely illegible within the US public sphere. With geographical distance from India and from challenges to caste entitlement, upper caste achievement abroad appears to be a form of self-made success. At the same time, the highly selective character of the US Indian diaspora makes even easier a seamless equation between being upper caste, being Indian, and having merit. Within the US Indian diaspora, IIT alumni have been particularly active in shoring up their status as uniquely meritocratic individuals. Particularly after the IT boom of the 1990s, IITians in Silicon Valley began forging a new claim to merit as the basis of achievement. Now, however, it was a form of racial merit, through which they sought to make Indianness synonymous with technical talent and brand IIT into a highly prized commodity. The early 2000s was a critical time for this racial project. Various magazines featured articles on the IITs. Forbes did a story titled Indians of Silicon Valley. Business Week came out with India's Genius Factories. And in a more sardonic vein, Scott Adams, creator of the comic strip Dilbert, debuted an IITian named Ashok. Most important was a 2003 episode of the news show 60 Minutes on the IITs. A carefully curated bit of publicity featuring choice quotes from prominent alumni that made the case for diasporic success as a natural extension of an IIT education. One of the highlights of the piece is an interview with Vinod Khosla, the co-founder of Sun Microsystems, who observes that Fortune 500 headhunters favor IITians over almost anyone else. As he put it, if you are a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant walking in for a job, you wouldn't have as much pre-assigned credibility as you do if you're an engineer from IIT. This project of self-racialization has been yoked to the cultivation of entrepreneurship. The Indus Entrepreneurs, an organization started by IIT alumni in Silicon Valley, currently boasts a membership of over 13,000, and its list of mentors includes the most well-recognized Indian names in the corporate sector. In conversations with both senior mentors and junior members of the organization, it became obvious that the entrepreneurial ambitions of IITians are the most actively cultivated. When a group of IITians bring forward a proposal, they're almost guaranteed seed funding. These expressions of transnational institutional kinship have both underwritten the commodity value of an IIT education and enhanced the racial mystique around the IITian's intellect. Together, such media events and institutional mechanisms have worked to elevate the status of the IITs and their diasporic ambassadors. But they've also produced new schisms between diasporic and homeland IITians. It's clear from speaking to Silicon Valley's IITians that they share an imagination of constraint and possibility. As do homeland alumni, they insist that in India, they were limited by a system that fostered mediocrity in the name of democracy, and where the IITs were islands of meritocracy. But there's also something new. In their embrace of entrepreneurial wealth accumulation as the basis of merit, IITs in Silicon Valley are increasingly at odds with an older upper caste orientation around higher education and lifelong professional employment. Moreover, although most are the children of civil servants and public sector engineers, they have gone from being beneficiaries of the developmental state to its most strident detractors. Significantly, their disdain for the Indian public sector now also extends to homeland IITians. As they see it, Indian conditions have forced IITians who stayed behind to slip into mediocrity, with the result that only the diasporic IITian truly embodies merit. The diasporic project of brand elevation has certainly had an impressive reach. When I asked IIT students in the late 2000s about their role models, most mentioned Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. They also used the language of branding to define their own values. Sandeep, a 2009 alumnus, pointed out that one's branch of engineering was no longer relevant. Even though they haven't done any related courses, everyone is going into finance and business and marketing, he told me, adding that despite their disregard for the engineering curriculum, IITians still get the best jobs because of the brand name. IIT Madras now offers a Master's of Science in Entrepreneurship, and a student-run entrepreneurship cell aims to foster an entrepreneurship culture on campus. Many homeland alumni also endorse the diasporic branding project as good for the institution. As one put it, the brand is a kind of ISO mark. You're assured of quality, like when you see a car made in Japan, it immediately sells. However, not everyone echoed these commitments to branding and entrepreneurship. When I asked one homeland alumni to compare alumni activity in the US and India, he responded without skipping a beat. In the USA, it's brand building. Here, it's nation building. As examples of nation builders, he offered a diverse list of alumni, including an Ayurvedic doctor, a school principal, a minister of environment, a petroleum secretary, some journalists, and the head of an NGO working in primary education. These are all IITians who have contributed to the development of the country, he said pointedly, but all you hear about now is Silicon Valley. Another alumnus who now teaches at IIT Madras confided that the entrepreneurship craze, as he called it, was demoralizing for faculty, whose students were far more interested in attracting the attention of venture capitalists than in learning the curriculum. Now, instead of engineering, he remarked in frustration, all they want to understand is the business of business. Particularly noteworthy was the stance of some Tamil Brahmin alumni who expressed a distaste for the blatant embrace of accumulation, which they felt was more aligned with a mercantile sensibility. They spoke of this as a disturbing departure from an older model of ascetic intellectualism that they claimed was a trademark characteristic of IIT Madras. One of them expressed his disquiet by saying, all these good Brahminical values that, at least in the minds of some people in the South, used to mean that you should be good in academics and intellectual pursuits, that should be the overriding ambition, and you shouldn't be taken in by all of these material things. All of that has vanished. The invocation of bygone Brahminical values speaks volumes about the continuing transformation of upper caste identity. As with the opposition between the general and reserved, and gifted and coached, new tensions have arisen between intellectual and entrepreneurial conceptions of merit. The diasporic model of merit, in which entrepreneurial wealth accumulation is elevated as its true measure, has not been embraced by all IITians. To their surprise, those who were once emblematic of upper caste meritocracy now find themselves resisting its most recent manifestation. So to conclude, In post-independence India, new patterns of caste stratification and consolidation have emerged through the very process of democratic change. Rather than the gradual erosion of caste, what we're witnessing is the leveraging of merit as an expression of upper caste identities aimed at securing arenas of expertise and accumulation against democratic changes. Such claims to merit make the inheritances of caste into markers of individual achievement. Tamil Nadu is an important precedent for understanding this process. By throwing into relief caste privilege as the basis of achievement, Dravidianism forced Tamil Brahmins into a reactive claim to merit as an expression of caste culture. From the 1990s, this dynamic expanded nationally, making more explicit the equation between caste and merit and polarizing consolidated groupings of upper and lower caste. Exam coaching was one spanner in the works that forced a redefinition of merit as both a caste and a class characteristic. And while in many respects diasporic mobility allowed for more unfettered accumulation, the project of racial self-definition has found detractors among homeland alumni who contest the equation of upper caste merit with entrepreneurial success. So what does this process suggest for our understanding of democracy? For one, the claim to merit as upper caste property calls into question the widespread assumption that only lower castes engage in identity politics. Rather, we must see the claim to merit as an example of an upper caste identity politics, aimed at shoring up historical advantages and forestalling progress towards a more egalitarian society. Second, the shifting expressions of upper caste identity and the shifting spaces of capital accumulation from land to central government employment, the domestic private sector, and the diaspora show the instability of privilege and the work that it takes to maintain the upper hand. Finally, these shifts in upper caste identity speak to the force of political opposition and the need to understand merit as a reactive claim against efforts at democratization. That's the talk. It's still not work. I should still continue to use the phone. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, you can continue as a bit. So can you use the both mediums as of now? I mean, we can see you on one device and your voice is audible to the other. So we can continue as such.
Can you? Okay, let's just continue because I don't want to risk trying to turn on the mic. Can you hear me through the computer as well, or is that still not working?
I think it's still not working.
Okay, all right. So let's just stick to the phone.
Yeah.
I think it should be fine.
Yeah. So thank you, Prof. Ajantha, despite the technical issues, for the elaborate and detailed talk on also explaining how caste is being rearticulated at merit and how the language of merit is being used to kind of preserve caste supremacy and caste privileges. So now I will open the session for discussion. So we will have two ways to ask questions. So either people can put their questions in the comment box, or those who want to ask directly can put their names, so I can call up the names. So before we open up the discussion, I would like to start discussion by asking two questions. So first of all, so recently I've read this work by Balmurali Nadarajan on culturalization of caste. So in this context, how do you understand the concept of caste as culture and not as caste as, how do the understanding of caste as cultural idiom and not as an axis of inequality? So how does this understanding of caste as culture kind of reaffirm or expressed in terms of merit? So what is the relation between culturalization of caste and articulation of merit? Yeah. And secondly, how do you understand the recently introduced economic-based reservation in redefining this understanding of merit? Yeah. So meanwhile, people can ask the question in the comment box, or you can volunteer to ask questions.
Yeah. So Balmurali's argument is a really important one. So, I mean, part of what he's arguing is that the culturalization of caste makes caste into a power neutral category, right? That it appears to be something that is simply about horizontal group differences, right? And it sort of takes away the question of power inequality from our understanding of caste. And not only does it do that, it both makes caste into a kind of horizontal power neutral formation that is simply about kind of equal differences, right? It also helps to sort of render caste and caste ability, right? I mean, not caste ability. It helps to render ability, collective ability, into something natural, right? Into something that is a kind of community trait, rather than as something which is the inheritance of histories of privilege, right? So it does both of these things, right? It both kind of renders caste into something power neutral, and it sort of naturalizes certain skills, right, that have actually been the product of historical advantage. It naturalizes them as something that is kind of inherent qualities of certain groups, right? So if you think about something like Brahmin intellectualism, right, it sort of naturalizes this as a kind of Brahmin cultural trait. And in that sense, you know, not something that is really the byproduct of structural privilege, right? As for the second question about you're talking about the EWS category, right? Yeah. So I think that the EWS category does several things, right? I mean, one is it's a way of, I mean, first I should say that, you know, from the very beginning, this whole question of what should be the legitimate basis of reservations, of affirmative action, or compensatory discrimination. What is the legitimate basis of compensatory discrimination? Should it be caste or should it be class? And this is something that has been debated from the very beginning, right? But I think what the EWS category does is it attempts to equate class and caste disadvantage, right, in a way that doesn't account for either the social networks and forms of inherited capital that even poorer upper castes enjoy, right? It doesn't account for that, nor does it account for the stigma that attaches to lower castes, even when they experience economic mobility, right? It leaves both of these things out of consideration, right? I also think that the EWS category has the kind of pernicious effect of invalidating caste as a legitimate basis for reservations, right? By advancing the argument that class is actually a more objective and therefore legally justifiable basis, right, of measuring disadvantage. But of course, you know, if you look at the persistence of caste stratification in India, it's more than obvious that caste, again, to go back to Bal Murali, it's that caste is not simply a kind of cultural phenomenon, right? It is profoundly structural, right, in its social and material effects. So I think that, you know, those are different ways that I think the EWS category kind of works ideologically. Right?
Yeah, see, we have some questions in the comment box.
Okay.
So one is by Viknesh, it's on EVS, EWS, it's already been asked. So he asked a second question, that's what analogy could be drawn between IITs and medical admissions through NEET? So he might be asking about the comparison between medical education and engineering education in terms of articulation of merit.
I mean, it's a very similar dynamic, right? There are very similar kind of arguments made about legitimacy and illegitimacy, about the sort of efforts to kind of disqualify graduates of medical institutions who have come in through reservations, right? To disqualify them as having the sort of requisite skills, you know, to do medical work. I think one of the interesting things about both medicine and engineering is that these were both sort of embodied practices, if you will, which at an earlier moment historically were disavowed by upper caste, right? Upper caste didn't deal with, you know, sort of with the body, right? I mean, that the body, which is so critical to both the practice of medicine and the practice of engineering, right? These are both like profoundly sort of embodied practices, that both of them were disavowed by upper caste at an earlier historical moment, you know, as being sort of polluting and as being more associated with lower caste. And then by contrast, when you look at the post-independence period, these skills which were at one moment much more prevalent among lower castes are then appropriated, right, as the kind of basis of upper caste professionalism. So you see very similar kind of histories playing out in both of these professional arenas. I mean, the other thing I'll say is that well, maybe I'll just stop there. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. We have a question from Sherwin. He asks that, don't you think this articulation of merit is extended even to school education through the new educational policy in the form of common exams at multiple lower grade as well?
I mean, the short answer is yes. You know, I mean, the new education policy sort of doubles down on, I think it's going to sort of retrench forms of stratification that already exist. But, you know, you don't have to go to the new education policy. I mean, primary education and secondary education has been profoundly stratified for a long time, right? And this is not just through the privatization of education. It's also when you look at the difference between the central board and the state boards. I mean, there are all sorts of assumptions about, you know, which is a higher quality education and which is not, you know, who is properly suited to one or the other form of education. And I mean, some of my, part of what I was trying to track in the book is this kind of channel between board schools and IIT Madras, right? And and I heard so many of these kind of assumptions about a central board education as sort of better suited and better aligned with IIT Madras. Of course, one thing that is sort of unspoken in all of this is the cost basis, right, of both of these kinds of institutions. That central board schools in Tamil Nadu tend to be more upper caste, right? Because they're intended for the children of upper caste civil servants. But beyond that, I mean, there's a kind of increasing favoring of central board education on the part of upper caste parents. So this kind of alignment between a certain school board and elite higher education, I mean, that kind of alignment was there even before the new education policy, right? So I think, you know, if we want to think about how merit services continued stratification, the continued stratification of education, we have to look back to a sort of much earlier moment, right? Yeah, and see the new education policy as in continuity with certain trends that were already underway.
Okay. So we have another question from Vikash Mandal. He asks, is there actually any form of meritocracy, or is it just a colonial construction?
See, for me, the very notion of meritocracy is problematic because it smuggles in ideas of individual ability, that it seems it's sort of advances a notion of the individual, right, as the kind of as the most significant kind of social unit, right, for determining intellectual ability, and in doing so, in kind of privileging the individual, it sort of helps to bracket these collective histories of advantage and disadvantage, right? So I don't think we can sort of neatly separate meritocracy from a kind of ideology of liberal individualism, right? And I don't think it's worth salvaging this notion of meritocracy because it's so antithetical to thinking historically, to thinking about power differences, you know, to thinking about the inadequacy of formal equality, right? Its inadequacy for actually correcting substantive material inequalities. So I don't think it's worth salvaging the notion of meritocracy. I know that there are others who don't want to give up the concept, right? And who think that there's a virtue in trying to make it more substantive, right? And I suppose, you know, one could do that by radically pluralizing our conception of what merit is, right? Of making it far less standard than it currently is. So, for instance, you would get rid of something like a math examination as the arbiter of merit, right? I mean, that's the most standardized evaluation tool that you can come up with. It's not only standardized, it's highly individuated. And so it sort of reinforces this idea that the individual, that you can determine merit at an individual level. So I suppose you can do all of that, but I would rather just think in terms of how to better keep histories of advantage and disadvantage in view when we're engaging in something like school admissions or college admissions or, you know, job hiring. I mean, that is the real question, right? Is how do we do all of this while keeping in full view that the individuals we're evaluating are not simply individuals, right? They're sort of socially embedded persons who come with varying forms of capital at their disposal.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. So we have a question from Lavanya Murali. So she asks, how to differentiate the capital of an Ivy League alumni, which does not have reservations, from that of an IIT alumni?
Not exactly sure how to understand that question. So, I mean, maybe I'll just answer it this way. So, yes, affirmative action works very differently in the United States than it does in India. The US, you know, in some ways, the two societies have moved in opposite directions when it comes to affirmative action. The US, from the 1970s, affirmative action has been systematically scaled back to the point where now the only argument that can be made in favor of targeted admissions or targeted hiring is an argument about diversity, right? So what does that mean? It means that that the practice is now of selecting uniquely talented meritocratic individuals in order to make institutions more heterogeneous, right? So that's the only principle on the basis of which you can engage in practices of targeted admissions. So in the United States, as I was saying, the argument is now only about diversity. It's not about redress for historical inequalities, right? So you know, to the extent that there is targeted admissions or hiring, the fiction is that, you know, we're only selecting for uniquely talented individuals, and not trying to compensate for historical disadvantages, right? Now, what does that mean about the alumni of the Ivy League? So even though there are not quotas as such, it's still the case that racial minority alumni from the Ivy Leagues are sort of assumed to have been admitted according to different and kind of less legitimate criteria, right? So very similar to how SDs and OBCs are treated in India as somehow having, you know, gotten a kind of unfair leg up. And especially when it comes to elite institutions like the IITs, there's the same kind of pervasive sense about minority graduates of the Ivy League, that they've somehow gotten an unfair leg up, that even though affirmative action has been legally scaled back, that this is a kind of sneaky way for institutions to continue to favor less deserving individuals. And, you know, what's interesting is that because affirmative action has been under legal attack in the United States for a while, it is mostly private institutions, not just the Ivy Leagues, but it's mostly private institutions that still feel like they have some room to do targeted hiring and targeted admissions. Public institutions, especially public institutions in states with Republican administrations, are under siege. They have had to scale back considerably, with the result that, you know, you take an institution like the University of California or the University of Michigan, which used to serve as a really, really important pathway to minority professional and economic advancement. They no longer serve that role to nearly the same degree because they're under constant surveillance by the state. So ironically, it's institutions in the Ivy League and other private institutions that have been able to do some of this, to at least in some measure. Yeah. I'm not sure that.
So we have two more questions. Let me club together. We're running up. Yeah. So we have two more questions. I'll just club together because it's kind of related. So the first question is, how does Muslim identity figure in the discussion of merit? Yeah. And the other is that how do you see the interaction of caste? How does Muslim identity figure in the discussion of merit? That's the first question. And the second, how do you see the interaction of caste and gender identities in meritocratic institutions?
Right. My main, so, you know, this is partly a function of my ethnographic focus on the IITs. My main question was about caste, because it was quite apparent that when it comes to merit, right, when it comes to the determination of merit, caste takes precedence over and above either religion or gender. So, I mean, the gender question is an especially interesting one. I mean, as is the sort of question of religious minority identity. But the gender question is a really interesting one because, you know, as you all know, even when it comes to engineering colleges, the IITs have the lowest percentage of women, right? And so a kind of natural extension of this might have been that women are seen as, you know, less meritorious than men because, you know, they're less than 10% of the college, of the student body. But what I found was that this was not actually the case. That when I asked male upper class students, you how they explained the low percentages of women, typically they would come up with social structural explanations, right? So things like, the conservatism of the family and families not wanting to send their girls for coaching classes, things of that kind. It was never about the sort of intellectual abilities of women, right? That was never the argument that was advanced. And by contrast, when you asked about the low percentages or the relatively low percentages of lower caste, the argument was always about intellectual ability and not about structural constraints, right? So there's a really interesting contrast between the two, which led me to think that, when it comes to, for other reasons, look, if I was not looking at merit, if I was looking at something else, the sort of gender as an axis of difference might have been more salient. But when it comes to merit, the most salient axis of difference really is caste. Muslim identity, it's interesting because it just isn't that, to the extent that Muslim identity intersects with caste, I think it is important and is an important sort of arbiter of merit, but not in isolation, at least not in IIT Madras. Now, it might be different in the north, right? It might be different in northern campuses where kind of Hindu-Muslim tensions and the kind of the stigmatization of Muslims is much more prevalent. There you might see Muslim identity becoming more of a factor in the determination of merit, but I didn't see that to be particularly relevant in the context of IIT Madras. But in general, I think, one has to follow broader patterns of social stigmatization, and to see how they play out in the institution. And I do think that while there are patterns that are common to all the IITs, there are also regional histories of caste and religion and regional histories of stigma that would be relevant and might vary across these campuses.
So shall we take one last question? What do you think?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So there's a question from Umesh Chandra. He's asking, there has been enough discussions on scholarship and reservation of SC/ST, but he thinks the real problem is fake caste certificates. So what do you suggest on this?
A fake caste certificate? Was that the question?
Yeah.
So people who use fake certificates to qualify for reservations?
That's what he asked.
Yeah. The fake certificate is a kind of interesting phenomenon, right? What does it say? It basically says that you have upper caste who think of reservations as a kind of instrumental advantage, right? That they should also somehow kind of benefit from, right? That if they get a fake certificate, this will allow them the same quote unquote privileges that lower caste enjoy. And of course, this completely misrecognizes that caste is not just that caste identity is not some form of instrumental, or lower caste identity in particular, is not some form of instrumental leverage, right? That it is it's a structurally located position that has profoundly shaped people's kind of opportunities, and reservations are a way of kind of mitigating that, right? Mitigating that social structural reality. So the fake certificate it does two things. One, it kind of makes caste identity simply into a kind of instrumental leverage. And it also sort of implies that the entire system is corrupt, right? That reservations are simply a corruption of true equality. And if the system is corrupt, that they too can engage in illegal acts of corruption, right? Because it's just corrupt all the way through. So it's an incredibly cynical reading of reservations, and it's also one that is intended to ultimately it's intended to sort of invalidate the entire system of reservations, right? Through this recourse to to try to corrupt it from within, right, and invalidate it altogether. Yeah, I'm happy to take more questions if there are questions.
Yeah, there is one question which we haven't addressed. It's from Lavanya. So the question is, in a situation with limited institutions and limited seats, what would consider an ideal alternative to merit?
I think it's an assumption that there are limited resources. I mean, I think one has to ask the question of why education isn't better resourced in India. You know, I mean, is education enough of a priority? And why is it that the state has systematically disinvested from education and handed it over to the private sector? I mean, it's fine to say that on paper, education is a fundamental right, but there has to be some follow through by way of resource investment. So I don't think we can begin. I think that the premise of the question is flawed. It isn't that there are the same thing is said about the United States, right? There are limited resources. There aren't limited resources. I mean, the U.S. has the most kind of bloated military budget of any country in the universe. So I think the question really has to be, why is there not a more robust commitment to public education in India? Where are those resources going? And why shouldn't they be channeled into what is more important? Why has education been sort of handed over to private actors in the way that it has? Which, over the course of the post-independence period, I mean, we've seen the effects of this. It's far greater stratification, right? And indebtedness, for that matter, as families who cannot afford private education go into debt in order to avail of these opportunities for their children. It's a question of priorities, of national priorities, and not of limited resources.
Yes. Thank you so much, man. We are done with the questions from the audience. Now let me ask Kaushik of Ambedkar Peria Study Circle for his concluding remarks.
Okay.
Let me hand it over to Kaushik.
Yeah. So thank you, Dayal. So yeah. So first of all, I would really like to express my happiness towards having Dr. Ajantha Subramanian under this joint platform today. So yeah. So thank you for coming and giving us this talk, man. So I just have one question. If you're okay, I can just ask this question. Is it fine?
Sure.
So yeah, if you look at how democracy functions, because there is a conception that the caste system it has many aspects, and one of its key aspects is it is a socio-political ideology. So it tries to alter or penetrate the political systems into what favors for it. So that's if you look within democracy, that we have different wings of democracy, in its modern form, be it US or be it in India. So we have bureaucracy, but if you look at bureaucracy, which is actually, I would say bureaucracy is the wing of a state which has the most form of meritocracy, along with hierarchy combined. So it's like meritocracy plus hierarchy combined within a system, which actually favors the most within the different wings of the democracy. And if you see, even in, for example, for instance, if you see in Tamil Nadu, despite the existence and thriving of Dravidian movement for almost a century now, if you look at the upper echelons of the state government bureaucracy, it's still dominated by Brahmins and upper caste. Even if you look at the middle and the lower rungs, even though some of it will be lower caste, they would have internalized this hierarchical ideology, or they would have just been silent with the hierarchical ideology. So if you want to challenge the caste system, if you want to challenge the idea of meritocracy, breeding further and further meritocracy, how is a different imagination of a bureaucracy or dismantling of a bureaucracy within our political systems itself, will this be a possibility towards moving towards more egalitarianism? We can look at it both within respect to caste system in Indian context or racism in the American context. So I just want your point of view on this particular phenomena happening. So how can we view this phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, so look, I mean, part of what you're asking about is, can the state machinery be separated from society, right? So, can the state machinery be made to be sort of insulated from the kind of the hierarchies of the wider society, so that it doesn't simply kind of reproduce those hierarchies, and in fact not just reproduce them, but retrench them within the machinery of the state, right? And yes, I mean, it's a really important question. I mean, how does one make the state machinery more, not just, I don't think there's any way of making it socially neutral, but can it be a mechanism for equalization and not a mechanism for the reproduction of inequality, right? And I mean, it's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine the state machinery as somehow being the vanguard of this kind of transformation, right? I think that it's better thought of as a reflection of kind of wider social structures and ideologies than somehow a technology for their kind of progressive transformation. So there's a really interesting book on Lalu Prasad Yadav and his impact on politics. I'm trying to remember the name of the author. It's escaping me now. It's called Democracy Against Development. It's a fantastic book, and the argument in the book basically is that, what he did was, there was such a pervasive understanding of the administrative machinery of the state as being sort of ridden through with caste power, that for him, kind of a politics of representation came to sort of supersede development objectives, right? Because development objectives were rooted through the state machinery, and because the state machinery was seen as a space of caste power, he went about systematically kind of dismantling that machinery, and instead favoring a kind of politics of a politics of representation. And of course, in some respects, this was positive, right? But in other respects, it kind of undercut kind of social development programs that might actually have ended up benefiting his own constituents. So there's a real question about what to do when the state machinery is so aligned with state power, with caste power, when it has historically been a mechanism for favoring, sort of upper over lower caste. When development itself has been a kind of, in some ways, arguably a kind of casteist project. So how does one address that without undercutting the incredibly important role of the state as a kind of redistributive mechanism, right? So how do you make the state, how do you give the state and its machinery enough autonomy, enough kind of bureaucratic autonomy to be able to advance, the goals of social equality? I don't know that is something that will happen from within that machinery itself. I think it's something that has to be the result of a much broader kind of social movement, movements to equalize society, which then are reflected within the state machinery. I know this is not directly addressing your question, because I think it's a hard question, and it's one that's not just about the bureaucracy. It's about the relationship between bureaucracy and society, and between, state-led social transformation and the kinds of transformations that come from broader social movements.